For almost a decade, Avatar held the distinction of being the highest grossing film of all time. However, last year it was finally dethroned by Avengers Endgame. Long before then, however, many people have criticised the film's status, so I thought I'd look at that today. Avatar was written and directed by James Cameron, starring Sam Worthington, Zoe Saldana, Stephen Lang and Sigourney Weaver. And when it was released in 2009, it was an event, with many people calling it revolutionary, to the point where it was even nominated for Best Picture. So, is it as good as they say? Well, we'll find out, in my opinion at least. For starters, let's talk about the plot. The film is based in the very far future where humans are planning to colonize an alien planet named Pandora for resources. However, the indigenous species, the Na'vi, don't want any visitors, so humans must upload their brains into the very specifically created bodies of these Na'vi so they can infiltrate the planet in the bodies of these avatars. Is it a dumb plot? Yeah, and I think it's kind of weird how the plot takes itself so seriously. There are some quite light-hearted moments, but for the most part it's a pretty serious film. It takes itself very seriously, and you can tell that a lot from the writing, from a lot of the visual storytelling. This movie's taking itself seriously, so if you're in it for a fun ride, you're not really going to get a lot from it. I think easily, however, the best parts of this plot are whenever they focus on Pandora and the Na'vi. I really like all of the visuals that go on Pandora. I think that the colour it uses there is beautiful. I think a lot of the shot composition is really good, and I really like that it just slows down at pace and lets us be shown what this new planet, a new world is like. Whenever we're embracing it, the film is just in a very good pace and it keeps me encapsulated in the story. I like learning more about the Na'vi and Pandora. I think that it's a really interesting culture and it's a really interesting world. The world building is really good in this movie, and finding out the sort of culture and ideas around the Na'vi is really interesting. It's really interesting to find out what their sort of society is built on. And it, without a doubt, is one of the more interesting aspects. I think the Na'vi make for some really great characters in this. In particular, Zoe Saldana's character, but more on the characters a bit later on. I just think that this culture, it's obviously Native American inspired, but it's giving us a breath of fresh air. I think this is probably the thing that people liked about the movie when it released the most, because in terms of its visuals and its designs and its writing, this is by far the strongest aspect when we go to Pandora. Unfortunately, when we're not in Pandora, the film is pretty boring. For starters, in terms of visual storytelling, I think for the most part it's well directed, but in terms of color grading and cinematography, you can see a very clear and distinct difference between what goes on Pandora and what goes on with the humans. Because Pandora is this bright, colourful, exciting thing, and then all of the human stuff just looks really grey and brown and just doesn't look nice at all. When it comes to actually telling the story, it's done through a lot of clunky exposition, and I'm just not fond of this exposition, so I wasn't really attached to the first act of the story. You know, I'm not interested in all of this setting up the world building, I just want to cut straight to the world building. The second act, because of that, because it's straight on Pandora with all of the Na'vi, and just visually, it's such a breath of fresh air, it makes the second act so much stronger. But then we have the third act. Now, the first act was boring, the second act was amazing, and the third act is just excessive. It's not very good. The world building used here, as it turns out, doesn't really pay off to a huge amount. A lot of the payoffs just kind of feel very generic, and a lot of the action sequences feel just very excessive. I feel like a lot of the messages they try and throw in here are done really generically. Okay, I get it. You want us to recycle, you want us to stop destroying the wildlife. This is a message that's done a lot in movies, and for a film that tried to break the mold so much, I'm kind of ashamed that this is what they tried to do with it. Anyway, onto visual aspects. The direction, I think, is very good, and I think the visual separation between worlds they do in terms of color grading, all that is, you know, it makes some sense, although unfortunately a consequence of that is that a lot of this does look ugly. The cinematography is fine. When it wants to be good, it's good, and when it wants to be bad, it's really bad. The music's pretty good, and the editing is alright. It's one thing that has definitely aged, and you can especially see it during the action sequences. Speaking of aged, let's talk about the VFX. Because this, I think, is both the reason why this movie was as revolutionary as it was, and why no one's really talking about it anymore. This sort of mocap technology, I just don't think looks very good anymore. In terms of this motion capture software, none of it really looks bad, but it's very badly aged. And the main reason it's aged this badly is, one, there's a sort of uncanny valley thing going on here. And the other problem is what a lot of movies from the 2000s suffer from as well, which is they try to make everything CGI, and because of this, nothing looks real. And CGI ages regardless of what year it is. So if you make your whole movie CGI with very little reference, it kind of just makes the movie suffer, because we know none of what we're seeing is real. And that is one of the greatest strengths of the movie, and one of the greatest weaknesses of the movie. It's what gave it $2 billion at the box office, but it's also the reason why Avatar 2 isn't going to get $2 billion at the box office. Speaking of writing now, other than its exposition, there are a lot of creative ideas here, and I do have to give props. This is a very out there movie. It's trying something new. Does it always succeed at trying something new? For the most part, it does, but whenever it falters into just being this generic stuff, it just feels like a slog. And I think that's because of how creative the movie was being, that as soon as it's something uncreative, we immediately notice. There's a lot of slow pacing and sluggish plotting at times. When the slow pacing is intentional, it is very well done, but when it's made slow at certain points, when it speeds up, it's just a bit messy in terms of its script. And then we get to the characters. Without a doubt, probably the weakest element in this movie is its protagonist. I mentioned this in my Star Wars video, but you always need a very well-defined main character, whose journey you follow and story you root for. Sam Worthington is a blank slate in this movie. He has no personality, he doesn't really have a main arc. The only thing he does is he goes, "Oh, I love the Na'vi." You know, in every scene, he's just got the same blank expression, and he just feels so safe. He's never really given a chance to express any personality. And I suppose that one benefit of having this character so bland is that because of this amazing world, people can insert themselves in his place in the story. But it all falls short because the plot of the story is based on his character, and it just doesn't work in this case. He's just an inactive protagonist with no defining traits. Thankfully, I did like some of the other characters. In particular, I think Zoe Saldana is a standout in this movie. I think she's really good at giving the physicality and the emotion to this character. And whilst she's not really given an arc in this movie, I did buy her relationship with our protagonist. I also think Stephen Lang is pretty good in this movie. He made for a very good villain. He has a lot of threat behind him. He portrays a lot of danger through what he does, and I bought a lot of the decisions he made. I also quite liked Sigourney Weaver. She was there, I suppose. A lot of the actors that were in this were also just there, but for the most part, those are the only ones that I remember. This movie is not for its characters. If you're looking for a character-driven story, you're going to find a barren wasteland. This movie is entirely based on its concepts, and it just doesn't really have a style that I feel holds up with telling that. James Cameron, when he made this movie, was really banking on the fact that he would make something that people had never seen before. However, now that people have finally seen it, it's just a case of I don't think it deserves that much credit anymore. It's like what people say about superhero movies like Blade and X-Men. Admittedly, they're not terrible, and they did pave the way, but they just don't hold up compared to what we get nowadays anymore. And I think this is where Avatar sort of lands for me. At one point in time, it would have been an amazing experience, but a decade has passed since then. People have moved on to new and more exciting worlds out there. If Avatar 2 had released in 2012, 2013, maybe 2014 when the film was originally slated to release, then I think that people would care a lot more about Avatar. But the fact that Avatar just hasn't released a sequel, I mean, now it's currently projected for 2022. No one's gonna care about it then. So ultimately, I completely get why this movie was as big of a deal as it was. It featured some revolutionary CGI and an amazing world, but unfortunately we've had this CGI done in other places now, and this kind of story has been done now. Everything in this movie has just been done now by something else, and to be honest, I think a lot of it has been done better. We've seen better CGI in movies like Planet of the Apes. We've seen a better sci-fi story in movies like Blade Runner 2049. We've seen more interesting worlds in movies like the MCU. Ultimately, this just doesn't have anything that makes it hold up, and because of that, I'm honestly not gonna say it's as good as they say. I think it's now overrated by today's standards. And because of that, I am giving it a rating of a 5 out of 10. It's not a bad movie, it's not a good movie, it's just fine. And that's the end of the video. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and if you did, be sure to subscribe, like, and comment. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.